Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Scales and Scoundrels, Treasure Hunters. It is the second volume of a comic book. It covers issues number 6 through 10 of Scales and Scoundrels. It's a graphic novel. It's a collection of issues number 6 through 10 of Scales and Scoundrels comic book. Spoiler warning, there is major spoilers for Scales and Scoundrels Volume 1, Dragon's Maw, and Scales and Scoundrels Volume 2, Treasure Hunters, in this content. Alright, so let's talk about this. So, Scales and Scoundrels Volume 2, Treasure Hunters, is done by Sebastian Girner. He is the writer for this project, and the artist is Galaad. So it's a two-person team. I think there's a few other people on it, but they're the primary artists on this. One's a writer, one is the visual artist on the project. This is a really special comic book. I'll give the overall structure. Overall, Scales and Scoundrels is the story of a female protagonist. Specifically, I want to say a female human, but that's not exactly correct. Specifically, it is the story of four characters. The primary character is Louvander. Louvander, at the beginning of the story, appears to be a female human, a young female human, who is I would say like a rogue from a classic rogue from Dungeons and Dragons. By the way, all this takes place in a very Tolkien-esque fantasy setting. Okay, so very feudal setting, very Tolkien-esque is the correct structure, I would say. Now, there are some significant changes to Tolkien, and we will talk about that. So Louvander, who is also called Lou in the comic, appears to be a female human. We'll talk more about what Lou really is in a minute. There's also a female dwarf in the story. She's kind of stocky. One of the reasons why we're going to talk about that is we'll get there in a minute. There is also Koro. She is a female bodyguard human, and then there is Aki, who is a male prince. Okay, and those are primarily the four main characters of Scales and Scoundrels. This comic book is very proudly deals with intersectionality. So it has intersectionality themes in the book, and it is very proud to have those themes within the book itself. And it really does make it quite unique. We talked about the Tolkien-esque aspects, right? So one of the things that is notoriously a problem with Tolkien's books is that they don't deal with intersectionality very well at all. And when it comes to intersectionality, there is there's very little intersectionality within the Tolkien books. Famously, when Peter Jackson went to do the Lord of the Rings books, there was intersectionality injected into those films, and that upset some people. It didn't upset me in any way. I liked Arwen. Thought that was a great character. I think that was was Arwen the character that people got upset about? I think it was Arwen. And then there was also another character injected into the Hobbit series as well. But this book addresses that, and so there are people of color in this book. The stocky dwarf is kind of there for people who are like more body positive. I think that's one of the themes in the book. Also, the book is very is very prominent about having female action heroes, which is somewhat rare within some comic lines or within periods of comics history, and that is starting to change. And so it really is interesting the way that Sebastian Girner and Galaad approach this, and it really does make the book look very, the heroes in this book don't look like the heroes in books that you would have read in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in traditional fantasy comic books, which is really cool. And by the way, I don't want to bury the lead here. This is a 5 out of 5 star book. The Scales and Scoundrels series is one of my favorite series right now. I'm absolutely loving it, and I absolutely love this book. I highly recommend this book for anyone's purchase and reading. Now, I want to be totally honest. I got to read this book for free because I got it from the library, which is I highly recommend if you're not using your library card, or if you don't have a library card, go get one and leverage the heck out of that thing. I love the library. Our local library is very, very good. And if your local library doesn't have what you need, that's not a problem. There's a library loan. So I cannot speak highly enough of the library. So I was fortunate to be able to get this book through my library. I read it, and it was really fantastic. And it was a fantastic read. The writing was really good. The art was really fantastic. I loved it. And I loved a lot of the really cool things that unfolded in the stories. I'll tell you some of the favorite things that unfolded in the stories. And I'll tell you some of the things that I thought were some of my non-favorite things that happened in the story as well. So what were some of my favorite things that happened in the story? So one of the things so let's talk about Louvander. All right, so Louvander is this female protagonist, and she is a treasure hunter. She's a very classic rogue type from Dungeons and Dragons, right? So she's a thief, okay? But the reality is, at different points in Scales and Scoundrels Volume 1, which covered issues 1 through 5, the single comic book issues 1 through 5 of Scales and Scoundrels, there were clues that Louvander was more than human. All right. Now that entire shrouded veil is pulled away in Scales and Scoundrels Volume 2, and we find out that Louvander is actually a dragon in human form, who is currently in human form. However, she is trapped in human form, and she can only take her dragon form for very limited periods of time. Now, the reason for this is Louvander is a very rebellious spirit. So she is rebellious to the dragon's council, okay? So it sounds like her father is like the Dragon King, and he convenes a council of dragons once every century. And this council of dragons, all these dragons fly in from different realms and regions, from differing areas, and they all visit each other, right? So it's really, really fascinating just how they manage all this. And it really is quite interesting. And so they all come together, and Louvander actually attends one of these once-a-century dragon councils. And it is exposed that she was trapped in human form, and that I think she can only take her dragon form once a year, right? And it's painful for her, and it's hard for her to hold her dragon form. And all the other dragons now kind of laugh at her because she's trapped in this human form. And one of the reasons for this is because when there was conflict between humans and dragons, Louvander almost always took the side of humans. And so she would very, very frequently aid humans when there was conflicts between humans and dragons, right? And it's really cool. You get to see, and by the way, when the Dragon Council happens, they actually all meet in their human forms. And it's really kind of cool because you get little aspects like their eyes still look like dragon eyes, you know what I mean? But also it's really neat too, just seeing what all these dragons look like in their human form. Very, very, very interesting. Now, another thing that's really interesting about, excuse me, Scales and Scoundrels in Volume 2, Treasure Hunters, is in Volume 1, Dragon's Maw of Scales and Scoundrels, our 4 core characters. Louvander is the main character, and then Koro and Aki are supporting characters, and then Dorma is a supporting character. That's not the case in Scales and Scoundrels Volume 2, Treasure Hunters. Here, each one of these Koro and Aki are together. You know what? I think Koro, actually, specifically, Lou and Aki spend some time together, and then Koro and Dorma spend some time together. but everybody's split apart, and there are 3 different stories that are happening. And specifically, Scales and Scoundrels is a lot less focused than Scales and Scoundrels Dragon Maw was. Scales and Scoundrels Dragon Maw is really the story of 4 people who are friends, who are journeying together. But Scales and Scoundrels Treasure Hunter is Dorma's story as she's escaping from this collapsed mine near where her family is. And you get to learn a lot more about Dorma, but it is a very isolated story, and when you are dealing with it, Dorma is just, in my opinion, so less exciting than Luvander, that and the story itself, because it's in a mine. Most of the literally the colors are black and brown and very muted, and it's just it was very, you're kind of like, when are we getting back to the good stuff? So I wasn't that excited about Dorma's story in this. It was nice to see Dorma get a little bit more attention. However, I think it would have been better if Dorma and Korra and Aki had been kept together. I don't think it was a good idea to separate the characters in this second collection. I think that was, from a story perspective, I think that was a mistake. By the way, the art in this book is a little bit better than the art in the first book, and the art in the first book was fantastic. The writing, I think, in the second book is a little bit off. I don't think it's even, the craft is not any lower. It's just the writing choices. Splitting up the characters really did make the story a little weaker, in my opinion. And there really are 3 central stories. Koro and, there's 3 central stories. I really think it's like Koro and Dorma, Lu on her own, and Lu and Aki. And there's a lot of stories going on. They intersect at different points, and, but there are points where they don't intersect. It's a lot. There's really a lot of complexity to the storyline overall, and it's pretty significant, changes throughout the book. So I think that definitely could have been a little bit better. Koro has some great action scenes in this, and we get to see her do her thing as a warrior throughout the book, which is really cool. Aki has some supporting aspects with Lu. I really think the writers really haven't figured out 100% what to do with Aki yet, in my opinion, which is kind of interesting. We'll see where all that lands. So overall, I did say a few harsh words there about some of the choices overall with where the story ended up. And I have to admit, I do think the story was just a little bit of a stitch off in Treasure Hunters than it was in Dragon's Maw. But the whole point of this is Luvander is an incredibly compelling character. This is a beautifully illustrated world. I am fantastically drawn into these comic books. Every page is drawing me, no pun intended, to turn the page and see what happens next. We've been waiting a little while for the 3rd volume for new Scales and Scoundrel content. I'm fairly certain that both the writer and the artist on these projects are doing other work right now and are attached to other projects, and well, they should be, because they're both very, very talented. So I cannot recommend this series highly enough. It's really, really special. It's like it's very much like it's like Dragonheart plus Tolkien plus intersectionality, and it's very, very cool. I highly recommend it. If you got the bones, buy it. If you don't, get to your library. Either way, you're going to be very, very happy you read this. I really, really recommend Scales and Scoundrels Dragon Maw Volume 1. I highly recommend Scales and Scoundrels Treasure Hunter Volume 2. Thank you for letting me share this with you today. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.